Right now we have a panel on research initiatives, and our moderator, Andrea Small-Howard, has a passion for cannabis research. She's been doing it for 15 years, so she knows what's up. And she's the Chief Science Officer for GB Sciences.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Now for something a little different. We're going into sort of research zone. I think that everybody in this audience probably has heard that research, we need more research about the medical uses of cannabis. But most other folks that aren't involved in doing medical cannabis research don't understand the unique challenges that exist to try to get this research done. And so today I'm really delighted to be here to moderate a panel that has some real heavy hitters in the cannabis research space. And they represent both sort of academic and non-academic research. So I think we've got a nice breadth of experience to really get at the issues of, what are the things that are inhibiting our progress towards that epiphany when we have enough cannabis research, so to, for example, reschedule or other interesting things that could happen when we get that magic amount of research that we need. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is, this is the structure for today. We're going to have each of our panelists do a brief self-introduction. And then our first question will be sort of open-ended, and it will be from your experience, what have been the opportunities and challenges in studying medical cannabis? And lastly, we're going to touch just a little bit on a federal level policy, which is the Medical Cannabis Research Act of 2018. There's some folks on the panel who have some things that they'd like to sort of bring forward on that. And we also try to leave about 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions. So without further ado, Sue, would you like to start us off with your self-introduction?
Yeah. Hi, guys. I'm Sue Sisley. I'm an internal medicine physician from Arizona. I'm the president of Scottsdale Research Institute. We're focused primarily on doing controlled trials, looking at flower, both smoked and vaporized flower, for trying to put flower through the entire FDA drug development process. So we're best known for this study. You probably heard about the FDA phase 2 trial looking at cannabis for treating veterans with PTSD. But we also have other studies. We're doing a clinical trial with University of Michigan looking at cannabis for chronic pain. We have another study looking at, we just finished a safety study on cannabis edibles. And we're also building a national patient registry, which I'm hoping to talk about later, a cannabis patient registry, very in-depth national database collecting information about how patients are reacting to cannabis.
Hello, my name is Daniele Piomelli. I'm a professor at University of California, Irvine. I have been studying cannabinoids and endocannabinoids for the last 25 years, more or less. And currently I am the director, along with Professor Bob Solomon in the School of Law, of the UCI Center for the Study of Cannabis that just created. Its mission is to understand the challenges and possibly provide solutions also for the challenges that are lying ahead of us now that cannabis is being legalized throughout the country.
I'm Mowgli Holmes. I'm the CEO of Phylos Bioscience. We're a cannabis genomics and plant breeding company based in Portland, Oregon. And so unlike I think everybody else here on the panel who is generally focused on the medical side of the research issue, everything we do is focused on the plant side. And it actually turns out that it's even harder to get plant research done in the United States, especially in universities, than it is to get medical research done. So I was also the chair last year of the governor's Cannabis Research Task Force in Oregon, where we were charged with putting together a roadmap for how the state of Oregon could get research done on cannabis. And our findings were that there's basically no way at the time for Oregon universities to do the kind of research that we wanted to do. And things are starting to loosen up a little bit, especially here in the UC system, where people are more aggressive than they are in other states. But it is still very difficult to get any of this research done, and especially when it comes to linking actual plants and what we know about the plants to medical outcomes. So that's what we're focused on.
Hi, I'm Tom Marcotte. I'm a professor of psychiatry at UC San Diego and also the co-director of the UC Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research. I'm a neuropsychologist by training. Just briefly, the CMCR has been around since 2000. So following the Compassionate Use Act passage, the Senate, the California legislature put aside money to look at potential medical benefits of cannabis. So we conducted 7 clinical trials looking at neuropathic pain, MS-related spasticity, ended up having positive findings in all of those studies back in the 2000s. This was primarily smoked cannabis or vaporized and also THC only. Currently, our center has 4 clinical trials either running or getting ready to start. So we have a take-home study looking at low back pain. This is an 8-week study. We're starting up studies looking at CBD for severe autism, looking at early psychosis as well as essential tremor, and also have some observational mechanistic studies looking at bipolar disorder and HIV neuropathic pain. The other aspect our CMCR is interested in is public safety, and so I'm the PI of a study looking at cannabis and driving and how to accurately detect impairment or not in people who've used cannabis. So we've been fairly successful in this sort of era. We have some funding from NIH, some from the state, some from private foundations, and are using product from NIDA, the University of Mississippi, as well as synthetic CBD from incest, as you may have heard, also plant-derived from Tilray. That was just announced last week.
And so one comment that we've been told, when you're speaking into the mic, can you speak like this? Because, for example,
That'd be
Tom,
really
it's hard
cool.
to hear you. Yeah. Okay. Well, great. So as you all know, we're really blessed to have such a depth and breadth of expertise on this panel. And without further ado, I want to launch into sort of the primary question that the panelists have been asked to address, which is, what have been the challenges and opportunities of working in medical cannabis research? And I wanted to sort of jump in and give my own sort of take on that to sort of kick it off. So back, like many people, I was introduced to cannabis in college. Although what I'm really talking about is, about that time that I was in college, the endocannabinoid system was being discovered by folks like Daniele. And it really inspired me to want to go do that work. So in my first postdoc, I was working at the Queen Center for Biomedical Engineering in Honolulu, Hawaii, in a Schedule I facility. And we were trying to do research on the effects of cannabis on the immune system. And what I found out really quickly was that it was really hard to get product, and it was really hard to get funding to do this work. Nevertheless, we did some studies, and it was a great period of time in my life. But I personally went off and did some work in the biotech sphere, where in my past, I have done some work in R&D and in quality and manufacturing of pharmaceuticals. But then I came back to the industry right now because it seems like there are some opportunities that exist within the state-regulated programs. So my new experience in doing research is in the context of working with GB Sciences, and we hold licenses in the state in both Nevada, as well as we are working with LSU Ag Center to be one of 2 providers of all the cannabis products to the state of Louisiana. And so through these, we have some interesting opportunities for doing research on plant genetics, on things like, we've been doing a lot of work on in vitro propagation techniques to ensure the genetic fidelity of our lines, as well as doing chemophore profiling. So it's been a really exciting time. We also done a lot of work to try to standardize, and we've done some basic science work to try to link profiles to specific disease indications. We filed 6 patents, and our lead compound is for the treatment of Parkinson's. And we were getting really excited because we were getting close to having enough data to try to file an exploratory IND in this area. But we hit a snag, which was, even though we had standardized our compounds at our facility in Nevada, to what I would consider a GMP standard, because of sole source, we couldn't use our own compounds. So we've had to source them overseas. We've had to use a contract manufacturer. It's Catalent Pharma is going to be doing our prototype formulations. And the process is super, super complicated, whereas if any other kind of drug development we were doing, we wouldn't have to go through these machinations just to get the compounds in the order and get them into a trial. So with that, I'd like to invite, say, Sue to contrast, or compare and contrast that with your experience.
As I said, we're focused on flower, so we've had a real challenge dealing with the DEA NIDA monopoly. Many of you know that the National Institute on Drug Abuse has enjoyed, through University of Mississippi licensing, they've enjoyed a government-enforced monopoly since 1968 on the only federally legal supply of cannabis for controlled trials. So even what Andrea mentioned about growing cannabis in Louisiana is still wouldn't be usable for any controlled trial.
Yep.
She can grow the best, most diverse chemovars in the universe, and none of them will be allowed to be used for any controlled trials, which really is the only thing that matters to the medical community, right? We only care about randomized controlled trials, and that's generally what gets published in peer-reviewed journals. So until we have diverse, until University of Mississippi is ever allowed to access diverse genetics, we're stuck with these, this really low-quality plant material without any access to any unique cannabinoids except batches of THC and CBD, and that's all we know about it. And so, if you dare ask for any unique chemovars that are widely available throughout the regulated markets, you can't get it. And I'm not criticizing University of Mississippi, I'm just saying that this monopoly needs to end. We've been striving to start a national conversation for the last decade about the problems with this, the fact that they need to license other growers for research. The DEA pledged to the public back in 2016 that they would finally end the monopoly and license other growers. They haven't moved forward on that at all. There's over 26 applications that have been sitting on the desk of the DEA for 2 years. None of them have been processed. And in the meantime, we could be enjoying a renaissance of cannabis research in this country if we were allowing other private growers to provide, we have all these expert growers here in this conference who could easily be providing important chemovars for our studies, and they're not allowed to. And I think we all need, as taxpayers, we need to demand that the DEA move forward and license other growers. And I think Tom can speak to the fact that what he just mentioned about the notion that Tilray, a Canadian LP, is now allowed to export study drug into the US, but yet we're not allowed to, any of our talented farmers are not allowed to provide medicine for these studies, is just an abomination.
Thank you. All right, so Daniele, would you like to? Yes.
My turn, yeah. I'll do my Mike Jagger impersonation here. You can hear me, right? So my friends, my colleagues at university ask me, why do you do this? Because I tell them what we have to go through to just run an animal study or an in vitro cellular study with cannabinoids, plant-derived cannabinoids. And if I walk them through the process, they look at me, then their mouths open and their jaws drop and their eyes roll. I say, why are you wasting your time on this? You all know what I am talking about, right? You all know what I'm wasting my time on. I'm wasting my time on getting a Schedule I license, which means that a certain number of things have to be done before, during, and after the process, just in order for us to start collecting preliminary results to write a grant proposal, which then will require another year, year and a half, 2 years, to be funded. Am I saying that this is impossible? No, I'm here and we are doing this. We just got a very large $9 million grant to study the impact of cannabinoids on adolescents, so it is possible. But so much of that energy could have gone to science as opposed to bureaucracy, to science as opposed to useless red tape. And so many of the questions that we would like to ask are just not askable. We cannot ask them. Very recently, we were on the phone with Tom Marcotte and a colleague of ours from UC Davis, who is an agronomist, he's a plant biologist. So I don't want to steal Mowgli's thunder, but Mowgli already alluded to the difficulty of doing plant biology with cannabis in the context, in the present legislative context. This person, at UC Davis, a very experienced plant biologist, had never done any work on cannabis. So when Tom and I introduced him to the steps that had to be taken, I think at one point we were considering seriously, Tom, whether it was worth the effort. So, and said like, well, no, let's do it. Let's still do it. So eventually, these scientists, we were able to, I think, to persuade him that it was really worth the effort, because literally the idea of having to grow cannabis at UC Davis in the present context was so hard for a scientist who is busy. You gotta also see it from this perspective. We are not in a for-profit structure like my two esteemed panelists, non-profit or profit, but you're dedicated to the study of cannabis. We can do other things, and that's why my colleagues, my friends, ask me why you're doing it. Let me say just a few words why I am doing this, because it's good to see the challenges, but it's also important to understand that these challenges are worth overcoming, because what we have here, I think, is a phenomenal opportunity. I would say a historical opportunity if it wasn't an abused term, but it is in a sense historical, because not so many times in the life of a person or a country there is the situation we have now where an entire host of chemicals produced by a plant have been closed to research and to perusal by scientists and to use by clinical investigators for almost 100 years. And now all of a sudden this is opening, slowly but surely, because that's the trend. This is opening, and we don't even know the questions that we need to ask. I think that is the amazingly interesting thing about this, is that we are opening a new window on the brain and the body. We discovered the endogenous cannabinoid system. We have the opportunity of creating new classes of analgesics that could be, if not replacing, certainly complementing the opiates, which are causing an epidemic that is destroying our country. We could be opening a window on new cures for new diseases new cures for old diseases like autism, like forms of epilepsy. And all this, I think, because this plant and its components and what it means for science have been actually closed to research since 1937, since the enactment of the Marijuana Tax Act under the FDR administration. So this is why I think we as scientists are so excited about this. I know Tom is, I know I am, the other panelists I also believe are just like I am. And that's why I think we can put up with this BS, because it's really, if you think about it, it's really BS. It is BS, and I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. Because if, as a scientist, I want to do research on cannabis, I have to go through all these hoops. But in a federally funded institution, in a public institution or a private institution that receives funds from the federal government, this is what I have to do. Everybody else doesn't. I mean, you have issues cultivating. I understand that. You have issues passing the state borders. I understand that. But if I was in a private lab in Irvine, California, instead of being at University of California, Irvine, and I wanted to do any type of research on cannabis, I could. If I had my own funding, I could. So now, why is that a problem? It is a problem to me because I believe that the fact that the vast majority of scientists in this country who are funded by the federal government, by the NIH, the NSF, etc., cannot take a look at this plant, it means that somebody else will. And those who will be looking are not necessarily the people that we want to be looking at this problem. Because they come to the question with an agenda, and we shouldn't have that agenda. We should have no agenda. Our only agenda should be get the data, understand what's happening. Well, I could probably go on for another hour, so I'll better stop.
Thank you.
So, after we had this research task force in Oregon, and we were trying to ask the question, how can researchers, medical researchers who generally exist inside federally funded universities, how can they do studies that with human subjects that actually use the cannabis that is available to people instead of isolated cannabinoids, which we know act differently, or the terrible, terrible weed that is grown at University of Mississippi. There really is no concrete way. So many researchers are getting really creative. They're doing observational studies. They're pushing the limits of how much they can suggest to the subjects of the observational studies what kind of products they should buy. And there's a group in Colorado that is getting people high in a van outside the university before they bring them in and put them in the brain scanner. But they have to do it on the street. So people are getting very creative. But in general, there's no way to get people the actual plant that they're going to be exposed to. And so what we realized is that we could get all that. If we wanted to do plant work, we could get it done more effectively in a company where we just don't face all those restraints. And also because we're not working directly with human subjects, we don't face the incredible array of some of the very reasonable restraints that the federal government puts on how you do human subjects research. But our job is to figure out how to understand the plant and feed the plant into those medical research pathways, how to make plants that have high levels of these other cannabinoids that we want to study, and how to characterize the plants in a way that makes the studies data understandable. So, for instance, we're working with a group at the Oregon Health and Science University now that's trying to do a semi-controlled observational study where they know what varieties people are taking. They can't administer the plant themselves, but they want to know what people are taking. But as you guys know, no one knows what anything is. There's thousands of different varieties. So we're genetically testing the varieties to try to feed those into the studies so that the researchers can know that at least everyone's getting the same genetically identical plant. So there are all those problems to solve. And one thing I want people to be clear about is that there's this whole raft of terrible regulatory problems, but that's only half of it. The other problem is that we're actually just dealing scientifically with an incredibly complicated subject. So the endocannabinoid system is really, really complex. There are many receptors that do many, many things. And then on the plant side, there are thousands and thousands of different kinds of cannabis, and they have perhaps dozens of active or potentially active molecules at different ratios in each plant. And so it's just combinatorially a hard scientific question to do controlled studies with anyway. And when you merge that with the regulatory problems, it's really difficult. But I think it's important for the industry to know, a lot of you out there are people who are trying to make products. And you're making them without much knowledge, Like right now, there's this new wave of people trying to make products that have THCV in them. because we think that's awesome. We have hints. We have a friend who smoked it. It was amazing. But we don't know, right? And we just don't know what's going to happen once we actually get data about that cannabinoid, and maybe it works, and maybe it doesn't, and maybe it only works if you also have this much limonene and this much beta-caryophyllene mixed in the same dose, and we just don't know, and we're not going to know for a while. But the industry is going to be reliant on researchers figuring all this stuff out. You know, in a big way, it's the project of the cannabis industry to map all the complicated universe of cannabis varieties and all the compounds in there and all the combinations, to map that complexity to the complexity of human reactions and human medical conditions. And we are so far from doing that. And the industry is so far out ahead of us, making stuff and trying it, that one whole other source of research data is going to be from the industry. I mean, we have this kind of unprecedented opportunity to pull in big data from the industry, which is being allowed to give people stuff. And if we can find ways to pull in that information, for instance, the kind of study that Sue is doing, where she's trying to set up this network of patient data, pulling in data like that from people who are using all the products out there in the industry, that's not a controlled study, but there's a new world of big data where we can pull in so much data, and it can be messy and dirty, but if it's big enough, we can tease out what matters and feed that back in. So that's the other thing that I just want to say, is that doing this research is really difficult, and we need the industry to care about it, and we need the industry to help, because you guys actually are in a position to help.
Okay. So I'll just add a couple brief points. One, I will note that regardless of what we think about the NIDA cannabis, at least in our studies many years ago, we did see a positive effect. So it's not saying there aren't better strains, et cetera, but still, even whatever you think of the NIDA cannabis, we still saw THC effects on really difficult to treat conditions.
Since you just said that, can I add one thing? So we just tested it genetically. We got a sample from one of the remaining patients, and we sequenced it, and it is 96% skunk. Skunk. It's straight skunk. And we talked to David Watson, who is the creator of skunk, and he said that actually many, many years ago, under a DEA license that the Ole Miss had, shipped some seeds to, I don't know how they weakened it so much, but it's real cannabis.
Well, I'm not saying, very interested in seeing what the other strains produce. I'm just making that point. But to echo sort of the challenges of doing this type of research, when we wanted to do a study looking at a high CBD treatment, the NIDA, the farm, ultimately developed a 16% plant, and then we ran into conflict with the FDA, who had concerns about the safety, that there wasn't adequate human safety trials in vaporized and smoking high CBD. So then we had to go through a negotiation to come up with a compromise of 8%, et cetera. But there are challenges with getting high CBD content out of Mississippi, particularly when it comes to any kind of oral treatment. They now have an extract I think they have going. And then the last thing I just want to echo is the frustration amongst all of us in terms of being able to access real-world cannabis. Yeah. So in addition to the medical side, which we're very interested at the CMCR, I commented that we're also interested in public safety. And from edibles to infused drinks, et cetera, we cannot touch those products at all to either see what's in them or to see what the effects are, either cognitive or medical benefits and so forth. So it is a very frustrating situation right now.
Thank you, Tom. So I wanted to throw sort of a wild card at the panel because it wasn't one of the ones that we prepared, but that's always more fun. So I think we've really covered the idea that the sole source from Ole Miss has been a real challenge as far as getting research to the level that we'd like to see it at, as well as the challenges of getting materials cross states and into different territories. One of the things that I think that we didn't really touch on, and I think is something that's super key to the industry itself, is the idea of moving money, right? Cannabis companies have a hard time moving money because you can't have a bank. And so speaking from our experience as a publicly traded cannabis company, we are fortunate to have relationships where we're sponsoring, it's industry-sponsored research, and we're working with 8 different universities in the U.S. and abroad. And the biggest challenge we have is what to do with the money, or how to transfer the money. And I imagine that all of you have your own experience with funding or lack of funding or moving money. And would any of you care to jump on that one?
I mean, I could start, not that I am an expert in money by any stretch of imagination, but the Center for the Study of Cannabis at UC Irvine has a legal component, and that component is heavily interested in the issue of banking in the cannabis industry. Unfortunately, the person who runs the legal part of the center is not here. His name is Professor Robert Solomon, and he's not here today. But this is clearly a matter that deserves a conversation that must be started, and it has already started, must be expanded state by state. There are ways, in my limited understanding, there are ways through which we can overcome the current restrictions that do not require any major intervention from the federal government. However, how feasible those ways are is a matter that legal experts adjudicate in very different ways. So what has predominated so far has been a very conservative outlook, basically stopping short any attempt to change the status quo. But I am optimistic, especially because revenues are at stake here. Important state revenues are at stake.
Yeah.
And important issues are at stake. How do you pay taxes? And we know that our regulators, our lawmakers want the tax money. So I am optimistic that something will change in that direction, I think, pretty soon. Mm-hmm. If I could also bring my very, very limited, very small experience as director of the Center for the Study of Cannabis, we reached out to cannabis companies, and we had an overwhelmingly positive response. Everybody wanted to help us in some way or another. And then we reached out to our own University of California Office of the President and asked them, and that was probably a mistake, no, just kidding, asked them, I always say it's always better to ask for forgiveness than for permission, right? But, we did ask their opinion, honestly, and they were understandably very, very cautious.
Yeah.
They said, well, if it comes from the selling, the cultivating, the distributing of cannabis, you cannot take any money, not even as a gift. Say, but how would a cannabis company work if they aren't doing any of those things? But that too, the interesting, and I want to close on a positive note. The interesting thing is that there is money involved, and when there is money involved, people get motivated. So even the Office of the President of my great institution, even though they are very conservative, they would like to change things. They just want to see some light at the end of the tunnel. And of course, I don't want to bring up this issue, a political issue here, but with the current political scenario, with the current Attorney General, that is quite hard. It's a quite hard stance to take when you have against you the Department of Justice.
Right.
Can I?
Oh, sorry, I'll go. I just want to address just globally, the research funding available in the U.S. has traditionally been available only to study cannabis as a drug of abuse. So this is what we've been up against, trying to do efficacy trials on cannabis. We've never gotten government money to study efficacy until just recently. We got our first government grant from the state of Colorado, but again, it's the states that are taking the initiative to study efficacy. The federal government, there's very little money. Only recently have we seen federal government money available, small amounts, to study cannabis as a substitution for opioids. Mm-hmm. But those are fairly small grants, and I really applaud, Tom and CMCR, their work. I mean, they have done most of the seminal studies looking at cannabis as a medicine, as looking at efficacy and safety in the same studies. So their work, we would hardly have any efficacy data at all if it weren't for the California state funding of CMCR many years ago and their now renewed funding. So I'm hoping, the reason we have data is because of these guys here that are doing this work. But I want to point out that, in Canada, we see Canadian LPs allocating millions of dollars to study cannabis as a medicine now. This is a big game changer, I think, that will help. And they understand that paying for clinical trials means millions of dollars. When industry people in the US tell Dr. Piomelli that they want to help fund his research, I think they're looking at, maybe a $10,000 grant or maybe, 5 or 10 grand. They don't understand to do a controlled trial is millions of dollars. The study we're doing right now, a simple FDA phase 2 trial with only 76 subjects is $2.2 million. And that's a very, low budget trial. So you just have to, industry has to be aware that when they say they want to fund controlled trials, that they're looking at millions of dollars. Maybe not for your work, but generally that's what it costs for human trials.
Oh, I was just going to comment that I completely agree with Sue about the funding being sort of few and far between. We have been fairly fortunate recently, sort of this take-home study looking at vaporized cannabis versus dronabinol actually is funded by NIDA, surprisingly enough. And this other studies that are more mechanistic, looking at bipolar disorder and HIV neuropathic pain, are also NIH funding. So there's a little movement in the direction to look at non-sort of addictive behaviors, but it's still not very much money.
So I just want to point out from a high level that even though I think it's really, really good that companies are trying to fund research, that was our decision, was that we could get this research done more effectively inside a company than in any other way. And the LPs in Canada have enough money, and the universities there can do work, and companies like GB Sciences are pushing hard to do real research, and all of that is critical, and it's going to be critical for a few years. But I just want us all to keep in mind that there's a reason why in the rest of the research world, the government funds basic research, and then when that research gets far enough along that it can turn into something applied, the private sector takes it over and brings things to market, and that's how the world works, and that's fine. But the reason why basic research is funded by the government is because it's really expensive, and the first many stages of most research programs are nowhere near a product. It's the basic research that lays the groundwork, and companies don't want to pay for that basic research because it's too many years away from any product. And if it gets done in universities with federal funding, you can do those years of basic research, and you can do them in a way that is impartial and not, prone to being shifted in any way by commercial interests. So we're going into this phase now where a lot of the research on cannabis is going to be funded by companies. And I think most of us are well-intentioned, but that's not how research should really be done. It should be done by universities without commercial pressures driving them to come up with certain results. So we need to get through this period, and ultimately the research should go away from you and me and go back to these guys.
I agree. Actually, thank you very much. Well put. One of the things we were talking about sort of as a group is that the cannabis industry is sort of plagued by pseudoscience. And I think that's really what you're talking about, is because there's that absence of a large database of that basic science happening like in other fields, things fill in the gap. And so would anyone else like to talk about that?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I have a comment on... I don't want to give this audience the impression that when we are dealing with the federal government, we are dealing with a monolithic structure, mono-ideological structure. Of course, the federal government is influenced by the administration. That's because that's their boss, right? But it doesn't mean that people within don't have their very articulated and strong opinions that they temporarily keep, under wrap, but eventually can and will, I think, come out. I've been working with the National Institute on Drug Abuse, for example, for the last 20 years. I've been a member of their National Advisory Panel. I've been on study sections. I know very well, and I'm friendly with their scientific director, with Director Nora Volkov. I know where they're standing on this matter. They're concerned, of course, about the use of cannabis, but they're also cognizant of the potential applications, the potential health application. They are cognizant. But don't forget, their job, their mission, is not to fund studies on the health effects of cannabis, the positive effects of cannabis. They're called the National Institute on Drug Abuse. They have a mission, and they have to study abusable drugs. So the abuse part is what they care about. So what we're really missing when it comes to the federal government is, first of all, political will. That is the first thing. And second, we're missing an inter-institute agency through the NIH, through including the NSF, Cancer Institute, the FDA, that looks at this in a unified, thoughtful, intelligent way and has a portfolio, so has the ability to access funding. Because this is not something about drug abuse or something about mental health or something about neurological disorders, or something about cancer. It's something about each of those things together. Yeah. And ultimately, scientists, people with experience in the problem, must be able to make a recommendation that can be heard. And that's why the National Academy of Science Committee on the Impact of Cannabis I was a member of decided, wrote as a recommendation the creation of a research agenda on cannabis that brings together all those federal stakeholders and gives them a unified voice and possibly a unified portfolio as well. So let's look at the federal government with some positivity. I know it's hard right now, but let's try and make that effort, because I think that's really, really important.
Very, very well said. Thank you. So the last topic that we wanted to sort of address was, many people may be following the Medical Cannabis Research Act of 2018. And one of the things that it proposes to do is to eliminate the sole source by forcing the EA to admit at least 2 more certified cultivator growers, and also open up some rights to the Veterans Affairs Department. I would like, at this point, to simply throw this one over to the panel for those panel members who would like to jump on that and give their opinion.
I mean, I'd say I don't support that bill, even though I recognize that this could be symbolically the end of the monopoly with University of Mississippi. But the fact that they're only agreeing to license 2 new growers for research, and they're probably going, this is basically just creating a corporate monopoly on top of what is already an existing university monopoly of Mississippi. So I'm not a fan of this. I think the only right thing to do is for the government to properly adjudicate all 25 plus applications that have been sitting on their desk and evaluate all of them in terms of merit, in terms of quotas, and let's do this properly. When I apply for a DEA Schedule I license as a researcher, every single application gets evaluated. It's not like we just say, oh, we're gonna look at these 2 just pick the 2 best. If you have a properly approved protocol, a scientific protocol, then you will be approved for a DEA Schedule I license as a researcher, which is what we have. But to say I'm only going to take 2, I think it's a bad model, and it looks like this has been created by some of Gates's donors to ensure that they get a license, and I think it's really unfair. But we do need to end this monopoly, and I'm hoping someday, the same way Tilray studied, or is planning to export drug for Tom's tremor study, maybe someday Tilray will agree to export flower into the U.S., and then we can finally break the monopoly on flower and force the government to license other growers.
Does anyone else
So I've been wondering, even if they do license to other grows, aren't the laws gonna be such that they have to get their starting material from Mississippi anyway?
That's a good point. That's what we're assuming, although I spoke to Dr. El Soli, who runs the University of Mississippi lab, and he said that he refuses to sell starter material because he said that that's their IP. So the University of Mississippi has, not that anybody would want their genetics anyway, but the point is that that's taxpayer dollars that have gone to support this monopoly, and now he's saying that it's protected as their IP and they're not willing to share it. So I have no idea. I think in our application, we had to list which foreign entities we were going to buy from, so we have to purchase genetics from outside the U.S.
I'd like to make 2 points. One is immediately related to the previous speakers and is not a scientific point, but I'll still like to make it, and it's the following. So if we think about the Soviet Union was a socialistic country, so property was entirely owned by the state, and then it became a private country. So in that process, not a lot of good things happened, right? I think we have to be a little bit thinking about that model as we consider the passage from a state monopoly to now a new situation where there is no monopoly and there are private individuals bidding or working to get a piece of the cake. Now, the reason why I think this is so important is because let's not forget that a lot of the folks who were growing cannabis were folks from minorities, from underrepresented minorities, and these folks are more and more excluded from the business, and they don't have a voice because the cannabis industry has a voice, can be more or less audible, but is a voice. But these folks tend to not to have a voice, and I think the one thing that would be terrible if I'm thinking in particular about the state of California, if moving forward we got into a situation from a monopoly of the state to an oligopoly from large corporations, and some of the folks who have been part of this industry forever now would be penalized. So that's the first thing. There is a scientific point that thank you. The scientific point, I think, is I'd love to hear your comments about it, and also your comments about it, especially as a geneticist, because I'm not a plant geneticist. So I read, and what I read, I may or may not understand. So here's the problem that I have with cannabis is that we have hemp, and then we have marijuana, right, with an H. This is how the federal government divides the plant, right? Marijuana and hemp. And they acknowledge that it's the same thing, but I think they acknowledge it, and at the same time, they deny it. Yep. And to me, understanding the diversity of the plant before we take any measure, or at least at the same time as we take measures to unpack this monopoly, I think it's really, really important. We still don't know, and Duke Magali, correct me if I'm wrong, but we still don't know if a plant has more THC than it does CBD. There is an enzyme that makes either of them. There's one enzyme for one, another enzyme for another. They have a shared precursor. Why some strains have more of one and why some strains have more than another? Is that how the environment can affect that? And how this plays out with the other 102 cannabinoids, number growing, that are present in the plant, like cannabidivarin that was mentioned before. So there is no talk, even at the federal level, and I know because I've been talking to folks in DC about this, there is no talk of looking at this from a scientific perspective and asking, so what is this thing? What is this plant? How is it that it has these properties?
So in order for us to have any time for questions, if there's one more from the panel, can it be brief, or do we want to just go right on to questions from the audience?
I'll just say very briefly.
Perfect, okay.
Those things we can figure out, and we're starting to. So we know how many copies of the THC synthase and the CBD synthase are in most plants now, and we're tracking down all the metabolic pathways. And then in the future, if we're going to have whole plant medicine, it'll be a genetically defined plant where we know, okay, this is a plant that makes these compounds because it has these genes, and those are knowable things, right? Yeah, and we're getting there.
All right. So, questions?
So a while back, the governor of New Jersey said when they legalized cannabis in New Jersey that it should be grown at Rutgers. Rutgers said they couldn't do it because the federal government would cut off their federal money. And recently, I believe that Jerry Brown vetoed a bill that would have allowed universities in California to grow their own cannabis. I wonder what you think about the New Jersey recommendation, and I wonder what you think about Governor Brown vetoing this bill.
Which bill are you referring to, 1996, or which bill are you referring to in California? The veto, yeah.
I'm sorry, there was it may not be correct, but I read it in the normal newsletter that about 2 days ago, Brown vetoed a bill that would have allowed universities in California to grow their own cannabis. Obviously, that would have put California on a collision course with the federal government, and Brown apparently didn't want to do that. But it looks like the legislature understood what Dr. Sisley is talking about, that we need, if we're going to do research, we need to let the researchers grow cannabis. In fact, the DEA's administrative law judge, when it came to the University of Massachusetts, said, yeah, let Dr. Craker grow his own cannabis. I mean, this is absurd. We're talking about research here. We're not talking about crummy 4% cannabis that is grown in the University of Mississippi.
I mean, I'll just say that of all the decisions that suck for all of us, that one I can understand, because the reason why it's been so hard to do research on cannabis in university, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, has been a general feeling that you're a federally funded university, and if you piss off the federal government too much, you could lose your funding and get no research done. And the UC system has been way more aggressive than any other universities anywhere, but they've also been very careful about it. One thing that no university has done is just start to grow the plant. And I think if a university went that, and that's the most frustrating thing for me, but I think if any university went that far, they would be in concrete danger of being shut down or having their funding stopped by the feds. And so
I don't know. So
I think that was a pragmatic decision.
I have a different experience. So we're working with at LSU, the LSU Ag Center, and under the state regulated program there, the university is allowed to grow, and we're doing
through a private vendor. So you're a private vendor.
Okay.
So there are models for that, but it's not on campus.
It's kind of a hybrid model. Okay, I get what you're saying. But there are, let's say there's workarounds. Yeah.
Even that blows my mind. I'm really impressed with Louisiana for doing that.
Maybe
we are very
you can
impressed.
if you're in Louisiana. I'm not sure if you can if you're in California. But my understanding of the veto, going back to the question, and I might be wrong, but I read the letter that Governor Brown wrote, and it specifically blocked a bill that was authorizing expenditure of $2 million per year to my friends here at the University of California, San Diego. And the reason they were made for vetoing it was not in opposition to science, was the fact that that wasn't what Prop 64 had explicitly stated. Now, so there is some politics behind this. I think the Bureau of Cannabis Control, which is the agency that has been created to really implement Prop 64, I think they, for some reason, feel that they are in charge of the entire pot of money. But this might be my overinterpretation of the facts.
It was my remote understanding that that's why it ended up being, this is 1996, vetoed, was sort of the complexities of matching up what CMCR was going to do via Prop 64 or other mechanisms, and there was some confusion. I don't think, as Daniele says, I don't think it was specific to cultivation and stopping that.
There's a lot of people that are looking for sources of cannabinoids outside of the cannabis plant, whether synthesizing it in the laboratory, growing it from strains of hops, or using yeast to grow cannabinoids. I wanted to get your take and see if you think that this is something that will pave the way for more widespread open research, or if it's something that would keep it in the hands of corporate research and pharmaceutical companies.
So there's a few different ways people are trying to get cannabinoids besides the cannabis plant. There are companies that are trying to put the genes that make all of the necessary parts of the cannabinoid pathway into yeast. It's hard for me to imagine that those are going to scale up in a way that adds up economically, because the cannabis plant is an incredible production engine. So I don't know what will happen with that. If that becomes the dominant way the cannabinoids are made, yeah, that'll centralize control of that in the hands of companies. But the plant will still exist. There is also now a bunch of reports of people getting CBD from plants that aren't cannabis. I don't think those reports are accurate. I'm sure someone will demonstrate that shortly, but I don't think that those plants make actual CBD. So.
Well, thank you. I think with that, are we at the time? So thank you very much for your attention to this panel. And one more time for the panelists. Thank you. Thank you all.